Welcome. In this presentation, we're going to take a look at part one of our series on culture in Dr. Brown's sociology classes at Central High School. And what we can see on this very first screen are various manifestations of culture. There is culture to be found in a Kantako hut in the Midwestern United States, in the architecture of cities around the world, of transportation systems in different parts of the world, in different modes of dress and speech and behavior. We find manifestations of culture. Let's dive in now to the objectives for this first in our series on culture. Our first objective is to differentiate between culture and society, as we will see the two are related but not the same. Our second objective is to explain material versus non-material culture. When this is over, you should be able to explain the difference between the two and identify examples of both kinds of culture. Third, we're going to discuss the concept of cultural universalism as it relates to society. And you should be able to differentiate between subculture and counterculture. So first, what is culture? Culture is not the same as society. A society is a group of people. It is the community that shares a culture, right? They are united by a common culture. So culture is a part of society, but society is the people, and as we will see, culture is what they share. So we need to understand what is that culture. Well, culture is a system. Right? It's a collection of things that work together, that interact together. And one of the two major categories of things within that system is a set of beliefs. Right? This can include things like rules and values. So for example, we have in the lower right-hand corner an example of a rule in Japan, right? A belief in Japan. When you enter someone's home, you should remove your shoes. Culture is also a system of practices that we can see varying between societies, right? Societies with different cultures. In continental Europe, right, the appropriate practice when greeting someone is to kiss them on the cheek. Right? Outside of continental Europe, among Westerners, right, the proper practice might be to shake hands. You might be thinking, well, practices and rules seem related, and you're right. If you are a man in the Midwestern United States and you greet a woman on the street, you probably should not kiss her on the cheek, right? Unless she's your aunt or your grandmother or your mother or your wife, or there's some other social relationship that makes that acceptable. But you would not greet just any woman you met on the street in the Midwestern United States as a man by kissing her on the cheek. Right? That is likely to be offensive rather than welcoming. Right? So practices and beliefs can be tied up with one another. Right? But cultural rules tell us what's different. You might have noticed that the woman in both of these pictures is the same woman, right? But her practice is different depending on what culture she's operating within, right? Which society, which group of people she's interacting with. And included in cultural practices is language. Language is a huge part of culture. In fact, studies indicate that how people perceive the real world around them is shaped by language. So language is a tremendously important practice and part of a cultural system. Right, let's look now at types of culture. Here we're going to distinguish between material culture, which is things that are tangible, things that we can touch, things that we can see. In other words, we're talking about objects. The automobiles in this picture are cultural objects. Right? They are examples of material culture. the train in this public transit system is an example of material culture. Non-material culture, on the other hand, are intangibles. They're things we cannot simply see and touch. There are lots of different things. There are ideas, they are values, they are beliefs, and there are attitudes. All of these are parts of non-material culture. And there are also all things that we can see within these images. In terms of ideas, well, here we have the idea of individualism, that it's perfectly normal, and a matter of fact might be desirable, that people are able to, and in fact do, transport themselves when they want, where they want, and by which means they want, through the automobile. If somebody wants to drive a small car to get around wherever they want, that's up to them. Right? If somebody wants a pickup truck so that they can maybe go off-road or take more stuff with them, that's also their choice. Right? It reflects the individualism of this country. This can also be tied to values. Right? Somebody who values their individual freedom and mobility might see this as the ideal way for people to transport themselves. On the other hand, someone who lives in a densely packed city or is concerned about the environment and maybe doesn't like the idea of all these internal combustion engines going at the same time would think that this is the way that society should transport itself, through public transit. Which leads us also to beliefs. Right? Values and beliefs can be very similar. For example, there might be a belief, right, as we can see in this image, that traffic should drive on one side of the road and not the other. We know in the United States you drive on the right-hand side of the road, whichever direction you were heading. It's a belief. That's how the world works. That's how the world should work. Lastly, we come to attitudes. And to understand attitudes from this image, imagine the person in this Ford pickup truck being plucked from their pickup truck and placed on this train. Are they going to accept this change of scenery, this change of situation easily? No, right? Their attitudes towards transit are, I get in my truck when I want to go somewhere, and I go. I have the whole cab to myself. Right? I can put whatever I want in the bed of my pickup truck and take it with me. This, right, is not going to be something that's going to be done without an attitude adjustment. Right? To give up your personal space, your freedom of going when you want, all of that is a trade-off. You're going to have to undergo an attitude adjustment in order to participate in this scene where you're very densely packed in, and that train leaves when that train leaves, whether you're there or not. Different attitudes indeed. All right, let's focus more on some of the elements of non-material culture. Just to focus on a few. Values. Values are simply cultural standards. So if we're talking about family values, political values, they are standards of what is good and what is important. So a political value in the United States would be that democracy is good, and the people being able to elect their leaders and replace them if they're not happy with their leaders is important. So it's a good practice and it's an important practice. It's also about what is proper and just. So for example, is it proper or is it just that some people have far more wealth than others? Well, in some cultures, the answer is no. It's not proper for there to be a lot of economic inequality. It's not just for there to be a lot of economic inequality. And so maybe what becomes proper is that we take wealth from some and give it to others to reduce that inequality. And that might conform just fine to that society's cultural values regarding equality. In other countries, the United States being kind of a prime example here, the cultural value is more that it might be okay for there to be economic inequality. That's currently being debated within our own society right now as to what our cultural value should be. Um, but what's just is letting people have the freedom to pursue economic opportunities as they wish, realizing that the outcome might be inequality, right? But we still see inequality as proper and just as long as people have the same opportunities to get ahead. Those are examples of values as cultural standards. The other element of non-material culture I want to focus on is beliefs. Beliefs are what people agree, broadly speaking, is true. Does that mean that everyone within a society that shares a culture has exactly the same beliefs? No. But it is what people agree is true. So, an example in America might be a belief in the American dream, right? That if you work hard and play fair, you will be able to get ahead. That's a belief. If people agree that that's true. Also tied up in a belief like the American dream is a belief about how the world works. The world works such that if you do your job, if you strive, if you put forth the effort and play by the rules, you will get ahead. That's how we think the world works. Um, if you have not gotten ahead, then maybe you didn't work hard, or maybe you didn't play by the rules, and now you are where you are. Those are beliefs. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, I don't know that that's true, and it's quite possible. The American dream is one of those beliefs that can be up for debate, just like values about how much economic inequality is acceptable. And before we leave non-material culture behind, we need to address a distinction between the ideal of our culture and the reality of our culture. Ideal culture is how we wish our society to be. It's kind of like in that perfect world, what our society would look like. Both of these images show aspects of Soviet culture. Now, all of you taking this class with me were born long after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. But in the Soviet Union, with its communist society, the ideal culture was one in which communism produced plenty for all. There would be flowing milk, there would be all kinds of various meats, cheeses, butter for everybody. Right? It would be delicious and there would be lots of it. That was the ideal culture. That was the culture of Soviet propaganda. The real culture, the way Soviet society actually was, the way any society actually is different than ideal culture. The difference was very stark in the Soviet Union. Contrast the propaganda image of plenty and delicious looking food with the reality of grocery shelves that were mostly empty with options that don't look particularly appetizing. Um, that was the reality. There was a big disjuncture between the ideal culture and the real culture. And those same gaps exist in societies around the world to one extent or another. Say, all right, moving on now to cultural universals. Cultural universal is something that is a part of every society. Right? Something that is, if not exactly the same, is understood from one society to the next. And to drive this point home, let's look at a few examples. One example of a cultural universal is music. Music, if nothing else, conveys emotion. And it does so even if you're unfamiliar with it. There have been studies where tribal, isolated societies in parts of Africa or South America have been exposed to European music. And what they found is that the people within those uh, isolated cultures, isolated societies, have still been able to understand the emotion that the music was conveying, whether it was fear or excitement, um, uplifting emotions, right? Happiness. Those could be understood even to those people who were unfamiliar with that style or form of music. Music is also a cultural universal because every culture has music. It can be very different. It might be reggae music from the Caribbean. It might be Tuvan throat singers in Central Asia. It might sound very different, might be very different, but every culture has music. Another cultural universal is the family group. Family groups also look different from culture to culture, from society to society, but every culture has a notion that the family is important and different ideas about what the family group looks like. So in this image, we have the family group of the American nuclear family that kind of rose to prominence in post-World War II America. We also see that smiling is a cultural universal. It is generally understood across all societies. It is practiced by all societies. But in both cases, smiling and family groups and music do not have to be identical. Just because they are universal does not mean they're the same from society to society, from culture to culture. For example, in these two images, we have this one identified as the post-World War II cultural idea of the nuclear family in America. At the same time, in other cultures, whether it's an Asian culture, as depicted in this photograph, or it might be an Asian American family that is simply adapting to kind of a shift in cultural values in this country that's more towards multi-generational living, where you might have a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, their child, but also the grandparents of that child, all living together under one roof and working to provide for the family, care for each other, and raise children. These are both family groups, and they both fit part of the same cultural universal, and yet they are not identical, and they differ in important ways. In terms of differences, it's a nice transition to our next topic in this first part of the series on culture: subcultures and countercultures. A subculture is a smaller culture within a society, within a broader culture. So it's a smaller subset of a culture within the main culture. These people will have their own group identity. It's something that sets them apart from everybody else. At the same time, though, they are still able to and do identify with that main culture and participate in it. So there is no question that these people can still function as part of the main culture. On the other hand, a counterculture, though it is much like a subculture, it is a smaller group than a culture, has its own identity. The difference here is that a counterculture rejects the broader mainstream culture in society. And often, either by choice or by being outcast, live apart from the main culture. Now, you might be thinking, as we've gone through this and you're looking at those two images, and some of you might be thinking, this guy has got to be the counterculture. Right? He's dressed in this outlandish costume, and he's got a helmet on. Right? He even, he's changed himself to not really look like a normal human. And yet, he is an example of a subculture. He's a cosplayer. Right? He is a grown-up man who dresses up like Juggernaut from the X-Men comic books and movies, and he goes to conventions with other people who also dress up in costumes and pretend to be someone else. And yet, despite being part of this cosplay community that has its own culture, its own practices, its own identity, when he takes off that suit, he probably goes to a pretty normal job and lives a pretty normal life. And he's part of a subculture. On the other hand, Amish communities represent a counterculture. They are a smaller culture within the United States, but they reject key parts of American culture. They do not participate in the American material culture of the automobile. They don't participate in a lot of modern conveniences that are part of our culture, electricity, for example, the internet, computers. So they reject a lot of the culture, and partly because of their rejection, they live apart from it. They are interacting with the broader society on things like public roads, but they live apart from the main culture. They live in smaller clustered communities. They have their own churches, their own religious beliefs, and their own community gatherings. And so they live apart. You will know when you've entered into a part of the country where there are Amish, you will see signs that indicate that you need to watch out for their horses and carriages or horses and wagons because they live apart from the main culture. And that concludes Culture Part 1. Please join me for the next part of this presentation in a separate video. Thank you.